Katherine Dolan knew the exact moment her value in Silver Creek, Nevada, had expired. It was her 27th birthday, when Mrs. Calloway had patted her hand with pity and said, "Well, dear, at least you have your teaching." The words had stung worse than any slap, branding her with a label she'd heard whispered behind fans and over teacups for the past 3 years. Spinster. It was 1882, and the mining town of Silver Creek had seen better days. The silver veins had thinned, and so had the population, but Katherine remained, teaching children their letters in a one-room schoolhouse that smelled of chalk dust and broken dreams. Her father had died 2 years prior, leaving her the small house on the edge of town and enough savings to keep her fed if she lived modestly. Her mother had passed when Katherine was only 15, taken by fever one harsh winter. The autumn sun beat down mercilessly as Katherine walked home from the schoolhouse, her worn boots kicking up dust on the unpaved road. At 27, she was considered well past marriageable age in a town where girls were betrothed at 18 and mothers by 20. She'd had suitors once, before her father's business had failed, before the wrinkles of worry had started forming at the corners of her eyes, before she'd grown too educated and too outspoken for most men's tastes. "Miss Dolan," a breathless voice called from behind her. Katherine turned to see young Emma Hartley running toward her, blonde braids flying. "What is it, Emma?" "Mama says to tell you there's strangers in town. Cowboys. A whole drove of them came in with cattle. She says you should hurry home before dark." Katherine smiled despite herself. "Thank you for the warning, Emma. I'll be careful." The girl scampered off, and Katherine continued her walk, trying to ignore the flutter of something in her chest. Strangers meant nothing to her. She was invisible to most men anyway, had been for years. She'd grown comfortable in her invisibility, or so she told herself. The house was quiet when she arrived, as it always was. She lit the lamp, prepared a simple supper of bread and cheese, and settled into her father's old chair with a book. But the words swam before her eyes, and she found herself thinking about Emma's warning, about the cowboys in town, about the life she wasn't living. A sharp knock on the door jolted her from her thoughts. Katherine hesitated. Visitors were rare, especially at this hour. The sun had set while she'd been lost in thought, and the darkness outside her window was complete. "Miss Dolan," a male voice, deep and unfamiliar. "I'm sorry to disturb you, madam. My name is James Porter. There's been an accident." Katherine's heart leaped into her throat. She hurried to the door, opening it cautiously. A tall man stood on her porch, hat in hand. Even in the dim light from her lamp, she could see he was handsome, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to catch the light. Dust covered his clothes, and there was genuine concern etched across his face. "What kind of accident?" Katherine asked. "One of my men, he took a fall from his horse, hit his head pretty bad. The hotel keeper said you were the closest thing to a nurse in town, that you tended to your father during his illness." Katherine didn't hesitate. She grabbed her shawl and the basket of medical supplies she kept for emergencies. "Take me to him." James Porter led her quickly through the darkened streets to the hotel. His stride was long, confident, and Katherine had to hurry to keep pace. "How bad is it?" she asked. "He's conscious, but there's a lot of blood. I've seen men take falls before, but I'm no doctor." "We don't have a doctor in Silver Creek anymore," Katherine said. "He moved to Carson City 6 months ago. I'll do what I can." The injured man was laid out on a bed in one of the hotel rooms, surrounded by concerned cowboys. Katherine pushed through them without ceremony, her teacher's voice coming out sharp and authoritative. "I need space to work. Everyone out except for Mr. Porter." The men filed out, and Katherine set to examining the patient. The wound was indeed bad, a deep gash across the scalp that bled profusely as head wounds did. But as she cleaned it, she found it wasn't as serious as it looked. "He'll need stitches," she said, threading a needle with steady hands. James Porter watched her work with something like wonder. "You're not squeamish." "I cared for my father for 18 months before he passed," Katherine said, not looking up. "You learn not to be squeamish. Hold his shoulders. This will hurt." The cowboy groaned as Katherine worked, but James held him steady, murmuring words of encouragement. Katherine found herself impressed by his gentleness, the way he spoke to his man with genuine care. Most ranch bosses she'd known treated their workers like replaceable parts. When she'd finished, she bandaged the wound carefully. He should rest for at least a week. No riding, no heavy work. Watch for fever, confusion, or excessive sleepiness. If any of those develop, send for me immediately. "Thank you, Miss Dolan." James's voice was warm with gratitude. "What do I owe you?" Katherine stood, wiping her hands on a cloth. "Nothing. I'm not a real nurse. I just did what anyone would do." "Not anyone," James said. "Most people would have turned me away at their door after dark. You didn't even hesitate." Their eyes met, and Katherine felt that flutter again, stronger this time. She looked away quickly, gathering her supplies. "I should go. It's late." "Let me walk you home," James said. "It's the least I can do." Katherine wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain the proper distance a spinster should keep, but the streets were dark and she'd be lying if she said she didn't want more time in this man's presence. "All right." They walked in silence for a moment before James spoke. "The hotel keeper told me you're a teacher." "Yes, for the past 7 years. That's admirable work. I never had much schooling myself, can read and write, but that's about it." "That's more than many can say," Katherine replied. "What brings you and your men to Silver Creek, Cattle Drive?" "We're taking a herd from Texas to the railhead in Reno. Silver Creek is a stopping point, a place to rest and resupply. We'll be here a few days, maybe a week if Charlie, that's the injured man, needs time to heal." They reached Katherine's house too quickly. She found herself disappointed that the walk was over. "Thank you again, Miss Dolan," James said. He stood there for a moment as if wanting to say more, then settled his hat back on his head. "Good night." "Good night, Mr. Porter." Katherine watched him walk away, his figure disappearing into the darkness. She went inside, but sleep eluded her for hours. She kept thinking about the way he'd looked at her, as if she were someone worth looking at, someone worth noticing. The next morning, she found a package on her doorstep. Inside was a beautiful bolt of blue fabric, the color of a summer sky, finer than anything she'd seen in years. There was a note in careful, blocky handwriting. "For your kindness, J.P." Katherine held the fabric to her chest, feeling something dangerous blooming in her heart. She knew better than to hope. She was 27, a spinster, a woman the town had written off. But the fabric was real, and so was the warmth spreading through her chest. She saw James Porter again that afternoon when she stopped at the general store for supplies. He was loading goods onto a wagon, his shirt sleeves rolled up, revealing strong, tanned forearms. He saw her and smiled, the kind of smile that reached his eyes. "Miss Dolan, did you receive my gift?" "I did." "It's too much, Mr. Porter. I can't accept it." "Why not? You saved Charlie's life." "That fabric is a poor trade for what you did." "I didn't save his life. I just bandaged a wound." James stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You could have refused to help. You didn't. That means something to me. Please keep it. Make yourself something pretty." Katherine felt her cheeks warm. "Thank you. It's lovely." "Not as lovely as the woman who'll wear it," James said, then looked surprised at his own boldness. Katherine's breath caught. No one had called her lovely in years. She didn't know what to say, how to respond to this attention from a man who looked at her like she mattered. "I should go," she managed. "The children will be waiting." Of course. Maybe I could walk you home again this evening. Check on how you're doing. The proper answer was no. The safe answer was no. Katherine heard herself say, I'd like that. The next few days fell into a pattern. James would find excuses to be near the schoolhouse when Katherine's day ended. They'd walk together, talking about everything and nothing. She learned he was 32, had been working cattle since he was 14, had a small ranch in Texas that he was trying to build into something bigger. He'd never married, had been too busy building his future to think about settling down. Until now, he said one evening as they stood on her porch. Until I met a woman worth settling down for. Katherine's heart hammered. Mr. Porter, you hardly know me. I know you're kind. I know you're smart. I know you speak your mind and don't simper or play games. I know that when you smile, really smile, it lights up your whole face. I know I've never met anyone like you. I'm 27 years old, Katherine said, trying to inject reality into this dream. I'm considered a spinster in this town. I have no dowry, no prospects. I'm not some young girl you can sweep off her feet. James took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. Good. I don't want a young girl. I want a woman. I want you, Katherine. I've wanted you since that first night when you didn't hesitate to help a stranger. You're leaving soon, she whispered. When Charlie is well enough to travel, come with me. The words hung in the air between them. You don't mean that, Katherine said. I've never meant anything more. James stepped closer. I know it's fast, I know it's crazy. But I'm 32 years old and I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. Come with me to Texas. Marry me. Build a life with me. Katherine's mind reeled. This couldn't be real. Men didn't propose to spinsters after knowing them for less than a week. You're caught up in the moment. In a few days, when you're back on the trail, I'll realize I left the best thing that ever happened to me behind in Silver Creek, James interrupted. Katherine, I'm not a romantic man. I'm practical. I know what I want when I see it. I want you. I want your sharp mind and your kind heart and your courage. I want to wake up next to you every morning and come home to you every night. I want to build something real with you. Why? The word came out broken. Why me? James cupped her face gently. Because you're you. Because you're brave and beautiful and you don't even know it. Because this town has convinced you you're worthless when you're anything but. Because when I look at you, I see my future and it's the best future I can imagine. Katherine felt tears slipping down her cheeks. I'm afraid. I know. But will you think about it? I need to leave in 3 days. Charlie's healing well and we're behind schedule. But Katherine, I swear to you, if you come with me, I'll spend every day making sure you never regret it. 3 days isn't enough time to make a decision like this. Then don't think about time. Think about what you want. What you really want, not what this town says you should want or be. If you could have any life, what would it be? Katherine looked at this man, this stranger who somehow saw her more clearly than people who'd known her for years. She thought about her empty house, her lonely evenings, the pitying looks and whispered comments. She thought about growing old in Silver Creek, watching her students grow up and have lives while hers stood still. I want to matter to someone, she whispered. I want to be chosen. You are chosen, James said fiercely. You're my choice. You're my future, Katherine. Say yes. I need time to think. Take your time. But know that I'm not saying this lightly. I'm not playing with your feelings. I'm offering you my life, my heart, all of it. That night, Katherine paced her small house, James's words echoing in her mind. It was madness to consider his proposal. She barely knew him. But what did she really know about any of the men in Silver Creek? She'd grown up around them, and not one had ever looked at her the way James did, as if she were precious, valuable, worth cherishing. The next day she taught her lessons in a daze. The children noticed, asking if she was feeling well. Katherine assured them she was fine, but it was a lie. She was terrified and exhilarated and confused all at once. Mrs. Calloway stopped her on the street that afternoon. "I've seen you walking with that cowboy," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "Be careful, dear. Men like that say pretty things, but they don't marry women like us." "Women like us," Katherine repeated. "You know what I mean. We're past our prime. We're not the kind of women men build futures with. It's best to accept reality." Katherine looked at this bitter woman who'd been widowed young and had spent the past 20 years spreading her misery like poison. "Maybe you're right," she said slowly. "Maybe I'm not the kind of woman most men would choose, but maybe, just maybe, I'm exactly the kind of woman the right man would choose, and maybe that's all that matters." She walked away, leaving Mrs. Calloway sputtering behind her. Her steps grew faster, more certain, until she was almost running. She found James at the livery checking on the horses. "Katherine," he turned, surprise and hope warring on his face. "Ask me again," she said, breathless. "What? Ask me again?" "Ask me to marry you, to come with you." James crossed to her in 3 long strides. He took her hands in his eyes searching hers. "Katherine Dolan, will you marry me? Will you take a chance on a cowboy who fell in love with you the moment you walked through that hotel room door with fire in your eyes and compassion in your heart? Will you come to Texas and build a life with me?" "Yes," Katherine said, and the word felt like freedom. "Yes, I'll marry you." James let out a whoop of joy and spun her around right there in the livery. When he set her down, he was grinning like a boy. "You won't regret this. I swear to you, Katherine, I'll make you happy." "I know," she said, and she did know. She couldn't explain it, couldn't justify it with logic or reason, but she knew in her bones that this was right. They were married 2 days later by the circuit preacher who happened to be passing through Silver Creek. Katherine wore a simple dress, not the blue fabric James had given her that would be for later, for special occasions. She had no family to attend, but Emma Hartley and her mother came, as did a few other students and their parents. The Cowboys stood as witnesses, grinning and elbowing each other. When James kissed her, sealing their vows, Katherine felt the walls she'd built around her heart crumble. This was real. This was happening. She was no longer Katherine Dolan, spinster schoolteacher. She was Katherine Porter, wife of a cowboy, about to start a whole new life. The journey to Texas was long and hard. Katherine had never been on a cattle drive before, had never slept under the stars or ridden for hours in the burning sun. But James was patient, teaching her to ride better, showing her how to navigate by the stars, sharing stories around the campfire. The other cowboys were respectful, if a bit awkward around a woman. Charlie, fully recovered from his injury, appointed himself her unofficial guardian, making sure she was comfortable and safe. "Boss man's lucky to have you," he told her one evening. "Haven't seen him this happy in all the years I've known him." "How long have you worked for him?" Katherine asked. "Going on 8 years now. He took me on when I was just a kid, taught me everything I know. He's a good man, Mrs. Porter, fair and honest. He'll treat you right." Katherine already knew that. She saw it in the way James checked on her constantly, making sure she had enough water, that her saddle wasn't chafing, that she was managing the pace. She saw it in the way he'd lay out his bedroll next to hers each night, close enough to protect her but respecting the boundary between them, until she was ready to cross it. It was on their 5th night on the trail that Katherine reached for his hand in the darkness. James interlaced his fingers with hers. "Are you doing all right?" he asked softly. "I'm doing better than all right," Katherine said. "I'm happy, James, truly happy. Even sleeping on the hard ground, even eating trail food and getting dust in your teeth," Katherine laughed. "Even then. Do you know what I was doing this time last week? Sitting alone in my house, reading the same books I've read a dozen times, wondering if this was all my life would ever be. Now I'm under the stars with my husband, heading toward a future I can't even imagine. How could I not be happy? James brought her hand to his lips. I love you, Katherine. I know it's soon to say it, but I do. I love your strength and your spirit and the way you took a leap of faith with me. I love you too, Katherine whispered, and she realized it was true. She'd fallen in love with this man who saw her value when no one else did, who called her his future and meant it. James kissed her then, properly, deeply, and Katherine felt desire stir within her. She thought herself too old for such feelings, too practical and worn down by life. But James made her feel young again, made her feel beautiful and wanted. That night, they consummated their marriage under the vast Texas sky, with nothing but stars as witnesses. James was gentle and patient, treating Katherine as if she were something precious. Afterward, she lay in his arms, feeling more complete than she'd ever felt in her life. The ranch, when they finally arrived, was smaller than Katherine had expected but charming in its simplicity. A modest house, a barn, corrals for horses and cattle. The land stretched out in all directions, wild and untamed but full of potential. I know it's not much, James said, sounding uncertain for the first time since she'd met him. But it's ours. We can build it into something bigger, something that lasts. Katherine looked at this place that would be her home, at the man standing beside her, and felt a surge of love so strong it almost knocked her over. It's perfect. It's exactly what I want. And it was. Over the following weeks, Katherine threw herself into making the ranch a home. She cleaned and organized, planted a garden, learned to cook over a wood stove that was temperamental at best. James worked from dawn to dusk, building up the herd, mending fences, breaking horses. They were both exhausted most evenings, but they were happy. The nearest town was almost 15 miles away and neighbors were scarce, but Katherine didn't mind the isolation. She had James, and that was enough. They'd talk for hours in the evenings, sharing their dreams and fears, learning each other's quirks and habits. Did you ever imagine this? James asked one night as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. When you were back in Silver Creek, did you ever imagine you'd be here? No, Katherine admitted. I'd given up on imagining any life different from what I had. I'd convinced myself I was content with loneliness. You're never going to be lonely again, James promised. I'll make sure of it. It was a promise he kept. Even on the days when he was working on distant parts of the ranch, he'd ride home for lunch just to see her, to steal a kiss and ask about her day. Katherine had never felt so cherished, so central to someone's life. Their first winter together was harsh. Snow came early and heavy, trapping them inside for days at a time. But Katherine found she didn't mind. They'd huddle close to the fire, James teaching her card games while she taught him poetry and literature. He was hungry to learn, making up for the education he'd missed as a child. You're a good teacher, he told her one evening. Patient but firm. Our kids are going to be lucky to have you. Katherine looked up from the book she'd been reading aloud. You want children, of course, don't you? Katherine set the book aside. I'd stopped letting myself want them. I thought it wasn't going to happen for me. James pulled her into his lap. It's going to happen for us. We're going to have a whole passel of kids running around this ranch, driving us crazy and filling this house with noise and love. Katherine kissed him, pouring all her hope and joy into it. I'd like that. I'd like that very much. Spring arrived with a burst of green, and with it came news that Katherine was pregnant. James was overjoyed, treating her like spun glass until she laughingly told him she wasn't fragile. I'm growing a baby, not dying, she said. Let me help with the work. But James was stubborn, insisting she rest more, do less. It was sweet but also maddening. Katherine had never been one to sit idle. The pregnancy was easier than she'd feared. She felt well most of the time, energized even. She spent her days working in the garden, which had become her pride and joy, and preparing the small spare room for the baby. Summer brought visitors Charlie and some of the other cowboys, passing through on another cattle drive. They were delighted to see Katherine thriving, to see the ranch growing and prospering. "Boss man's done good for himself," Charlie said, watching James fuss over Katherine. "Never seen him so settled and happy." "I've done good for myself too," Katherine replied. "I found a man who sees me for who I am and loves me anyway." "Loves you because of who you are," Charlie corrected. "That's the difference." Their son was born in October, during a thunderstorm that rattled the windows and made the whole house shake. The nearest midwife was too far away to fetch in time, so James delivered the baby himself, with hands that shook but remained steady when it mattered. "It's a boy," he said, voice choked with emotion as he placed the squalling infant in Katherine's arms. "We have a son." Katherine looked down at the tiny, perfect face and felt her heart expand in ways she hadn't known possible. "What should we name him?" "After your father," James said. Thomas Porter, if that's all right with you." Katherine nodded, tears streaming down her face. "It's perfect." Thomas was a good baby, sweet-tempered and curious. Katherine had worried she wouldn't know how to be a mother, having no example to follow since her own mother had died when she was young. But the love came naturally, as did the patience and the fierce protectiveness. James was a devoted father, rushing through his work to spend time with his son, reading to him even though Thomas was too young to understand, telling him stories about the ranch and the cattle and the wide world beyond their property lines. "I want him to know he can be anything," James told Katherine one night. "I want him to have the education I didn't, the opportunities I never had." "We'll make sure of it," Katherine promised. "Between the two of us, he'll have everything he needs." The years passed quickly. Thomas grew into a sturdy toddler, then a curious little boy. Katherine taught him his letters and numbers, while James taught him to ride and rope. The ranch prospered, growing larger as James's hard work and smart business decisions paid off. They had 2 more children, a daughter they named Mary, after James's mother, and another son they called William. The house that had once seemed too quiet now rang with laughter and arguments and the constant noise of childhood. Katherine's days were full to bursting, but she'd never been happier. She'd gone from a lonely spinster in a dying town to a wife and mother with a home full of love. Sometimes she'd catch sight of herself in the mirror and be surprised by the woman looking back happy, fulfilled, loved. "What are you thinking about?" James asked one evening. The children were finally asleep, and they'd stolen a moment alone on the porch, the place where they'd shared so many dreams. "About how different my life is from what I thought it would be," Katherine said. "About how close I came to never having this." James pulled her close. "But you do have this. We have this. And I thank God every day that I stopped in Silver Creek, that Charlie fell off his horse, that you answered your door that night. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd said no, if I'd been too afraid to take the chance?" "Every day," James admitted. "And every day I'm grateful you were brave enough to say yes. You're the bravest person I know, Katherine, braver than any cowboy or gunslinger. You took a leap of faith on a stranger and built a whole life out of that single moment of courage." Katherine kissed him, tasting love and home and future on his lips. "You gave me a reason to be brave. You saw me when I was invisible. You called me your future when everyone else had written me off as a spinster with no prospects." "Their loss," James said firmly. "My gain. Best decision I ever made was asking you to marry me. Second best was kissing you right now." They laughed together, the sound carrying across the quiet night. Inside, one of the children stirred, calling for water. Katherine moved to go, but James stopped her. "I'll get it. You rest." She watched him disappear inside, this man who'd changed everything, who'd loved her when she'd stopped believing anyone could. She thought about the woman she'd been in Silver Creek, bitter, lonely, resigned to a life half-lived. That woman felt like a stranger now. Thomas appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleepy eyes. At 7, he was starting to look more like his father every day, the same dark hair, the same determined set to his jaw. "Mama, can you tell me a story?" Katherine held out her arms and he climbed into her lap, still small enough to fit, though he was growing so fast. "What kind of story? Tell me about how you and Papa met, about the cowboy and the teacher." Katherine smiled. It was his favorite story, one she'd told dozens of times but never tired of telling. "Well, it all started on a dark night in a town called Silver Creek. I was home alone when there came a knock at my door." James returned and settled beside them, adding his own details to the familiar tale. Mary wandered out next, drawn by the sound of voices, then William, never wanting to be left out. They all piled together on the porch, a tangle of family and love, and Katherine's voice wove the story of two people who'd found each other against all odds. "And then Papa said I was his future," Katherine said, reaching the best part, the part that always made her heart swell. "Because you were," James interjected, kissing the top of her head. "You are. You and these 3 troublemakers, my whole future right here." The children giggled, but Katherine felt tears prick her eyes. Even after all these years, after everything they'd built together, the depth of James's love still overwhelmed her sometimes. Eventually, they herded the children back to bed. Katherine tucked each one in, listening to their prayers, kissing their foreheads. These children, these impossible blessings she'd never thought she'd have, they were miracles, every one of them. Back in their own room, James pulled Katherine close. "Happy. Happier than I ever dreamed possible," she said honestly. "You know, I used to pray for a different life. I'd lie in my empty house in Silver Creek and beg God to send me something, anything, to break up the loneliness. And then he sent you. I'm glad he did. I'm glad we found each other." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, as they had every night since leaving Silver Creek all those years ago. Katherine's last thought before sleep claimed her was one of gratitude for the knock on her door that had changed everything, for the courage to say yes, for the man who'd seen her value when she'd forgotten it herself. The years continued to unfold like pages in a well-loved book. Thomas grew tall and strong with his father's work ethic and his mother's quick mind. He'd announced at 12 that he wanted to go to university, and James and Katherine were determined to make it happen. Mary was creative and spirited, always drawing or making up elaborate stories. William was the peacemaker, gentle-hearted and kind. When Thomas turned 15, James hired more help for the ranch so he could spend more time preparing his son for the wider world. Katherine taught Thomas advanced mathematics and literature, stretched to the limits of her own education but never backing down from a challenge. "You're giving him what I never had," James said one evening, watching Katherine and Thomas pore over a Latin text together. "We're giving him what he needs," Katherine corrected. "Both of us. He has your strength and determination. The education is just tools for him to use." Mary wanted to learn too, insisting she was just as smart as her brother. Katherine was thrilled. She'd never believed that education should be limited by gender. She taught both her older children with equal vigor while William played nearby, absorbing knowledge like a sponge even at his young age. The ranch had grown into one of the most successful in the region. James had earned a reputation for fairness and honesty, for treating his workers well and his cattle better. Other ranchers came to him for advice, and Katherine often fed a tableful of weathered cowboys and businessmen, listening to their discussions about markets and breeding stock and water rights. She'd learned to love this life in ways she'd never expected. The wild, open country had become home. The people, initially so different from the townfolk she'd known in Nevada, had become friends. She'd found her place, not as a spinster schoolteacher waiting for life to pass her by, but as a vital part of a community, a family, a future. One spring, when Katherine was 43 and James was 48, they received news that Silver Creek had become a ghost town. The last of the silver had played out, and the remaining residents had moved on to greener pastures. Does it make you sad? James asked, reading the letter over her shoulder. Katherine thought about it. A little. It was my home for a long time, but mostly I just feel grateful that I left when I did. I could have stayed, could have slowly withered away with the town. Instead, I have this. I have you and our children and a life so full I sometimes can't believe it's real. It's real, James assured her. Every bit of it, and it's only going to get better. He was right. Thomas went to university in California studying law. He came home for visits bursting with knowledge and ideas, making both his parents proud enough to burst. Mary announced she wanted to be a teacher like her mother, and Katherine helped her establish a small school on the ranch for the children of their workers and nearby families. William decided ranching was his calling and threw himself into learning every aspect of the business from his father. James was delighted to have a son who wanted to carry on what he'd built, who loved the land and the work as much as he did. When Katherine was 45, she realized she was pregnant again. It came as a shock. She'd thought those days were behind her. James was concerned about the risks at her age, but Katherine felt oddly calm about it. We've been blessed this far, she said. I'm choosing to trust that will continue. The pregnancy was harder than the others had been. Katherine tired easily and couldn't do as much as she wanted. But surrounded by her family, cared for by James and the children, she felt safe and loved. Their daughter, a surprise late blessing, was born healthy and squalling on a beautiful autumn morning. They named her Grace because that's what she felt like. Pure grace, an unexpected gift at the end of Katherine's childbearing years. 4 children, James said, cradling the tiny infant with practiced ease. We've built ourselves quite a legacy. We've built ourselves a family, Katherine corrected. That's worth more than any legacy. As Grace grew, Katherine couldn't help but notice how different her experience of this child was. With the others, she'd been young and unsure, learning as she went. Now she was older, more confident, able to savor each moment because she knew how quickly they passed. James was equally smitten with their youngest daughter, spoiling her shamelessly. Thomas teased him about going soft in his old age, but Katherine saw the love shining in her husband's eyes whenever he looked at any of their children. This was a man who'd found his purpose not in building an empire, but in building a family. The years that followed were peaceful ones. Thomas established a successful law practice and married a sweet woman named Sarah. They gave Katherine and James their first grandchild, a boy they named James after his grandfather. Katherine held the baby and felt the circle of life complete itself in the most beautiful way. Mary married one of the neighboring ranchers' sons and combined her teaching with raising her own children. She was a natural mother, patient and creative, and Katherine loved watching her daughter bloom into the woman she was meant to be. William took over more and more of the ranch operations as James slowed down, his body finally showing the wear of decades of hard physical labor. But James didn't resent growing older. He said he'd earned every gray hair and aching joint, and he'd do it all again in a heartbeat. Grace grew into a spirited teenager with her mother's quick mind and her father's stubborn determination. She announced she wanted to go to university too, to study medicine. James was supportive, though Katherine knew it worried him to think of his youngest daughter so far away. "She needs to follow her dreams," Katherine reminded him. "The same way I followed mine when I left Silver Creek with you." "I know," James sighed, "but she's my baby girl. She'll always be that, no matter where she goes or what she becomes. You taught me that love doesn't limit, it empowers. Let her fly." So Grace went to university, coming home bursting with medical knowledge and stories of the modern world that was emerging around them. It was 1910, and the West was changing. The wild frontier they'd known was being tamed, civilized, transformed into something new. Sometimes Katherine and James would sit on their porch, the same spot where they'd shared so many moments over the years, and marvel at how much had changed. "You miss the old days?" Katherine asked one evening. "The open range, the cattle drives, the wild freedom of it all?" James considered the question. "Sometimes, but not enough to want them back. I like this better, the settled life, the family around us, watching our grandchildren grow. This is what all that wildness was for, to build something that lasts." Katherine leaned against his shoulder, still fitting perfectly into the space beside him even after all these years. "I never thanked you properly." "For what?" "For seeing me. For choosing me when I'd convinced myself I wasn't worth choosing. For calling me your future and then building that future with me day by day, year by year." James turned to look at her, his eyes still holding the same warmth they had when he'd first knocked on her door all those years ago. "Katherine, you saved my life just as surely as you saved Charlie's that night. I was building a ranch but not a home, making money but not meaning. You gave me purpose. You gave me everything." They kissed, aged lips meeting with the same tenderness as young ones had decades before. Love, Katherine had learned, didn't fade with time, it deepened, roots growing stronger and reaching further down. More grandchildren came, filling the ranch house with noise and laughter during visits. Katherine delighted in spoiling them, in reading them stories and teaching them songs. James built them a swing in the old oak tree and taught them to ride gentle horses around the paddock. When Katherine turned 60, the family threw her a grand party. All 4 children came, along with their spouses and children. The house overflowed with love and chaos and joy. Looking around at the faces of the family she and James had created, Katherine felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Thomas stood to make a toast. "To our mother, who showed us that it's never too late to be brave, to take chances, to choose love over fear. Everything we are, everything we have, started with your courage." Katherine wiped tears from her eyes as everyone raised their glasses. James squeezed her hand under the table. "Speech," someone called, and the whole family took up the chant. Katherine stood, her legs not as steady as they once were, but her voice still strong. "I don't know what to say except thank you. Thank you for making my life so much richer and fuller than I ever dreamed possible. I was called a spinster once, told I had no future, no prospects. But then a cowboy knocked on my door and changed everything. He saw worth in me when I'd stopped seeing it in myself. He called me his future, and together we built this, all of you, this beautiful, chaotic, perfect family. You are my legacy, my joy, my everything. I love you all more than words can express." There wasn't a dry eye in the house. James stood and wrapped his arms around her, and their children piled on until they were surrounded by love from all sides. Later, after everyone had gone to bed, Katherine and James found themselves back on the porch. It was their place, their spot for reflection and conversation and simply being together. 60 years old, Katherine mused. I remember being 27 and thinking my life was over. Now I'm 60, and I feel like I'm still in the middle of a grand adventure. That's because you are, James said. We are. As long as we're together, the adventure continues. They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands and watching the stars. The same stars that had witnessed their vows, that had been overhead during that first night together on the trail, that had shone down on them through decades of life lived fully and loved deeply. Katherine thought about the woman she'd been lonely, resigned, invisible. She thought about the moment she'd chosen courage over comfort, had said yes to a future she couldn't see or predict. Best decision she'd ever made. "I'd do it again," she said aloud. "Do what again?" "All of it. Even knowing how hard some parts would be, how much work it would take, how many challenges we'd face, I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. For this, for you, for the life we built." James raised her hand to his lips. "So would I. Every day with you has been a gift, Katherine. You're still my future, even now. Every tomorrow I want it to be with you." They stayed there until the stars began to fade and the first hints of dawn touched the horizon. Inside the house, their family slept safe and warm. Around them, the ranch they'd built together stood as testament to decades of hard work and love. And between them, the bond that had started with a simple choice to be brave, to say yes, to reach for something more continued to hold strong. Katherine Porter had been called a spinster once, but a cowboy had said she was his future. And together, they'd proved that it's never too late for love, never too late for happiness, never too late to find the life you were always meant to live. Years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and challenges. James's health began to decline in his 70s. Nothing serious at first, just the natural wearing down of a body that had worked hard for decades. Katherine nursed him through a bout of pneumonia one winter, her old skills from caring for her father coming back to her. "You're good at this," James said weakly from the bed. "I've had practice," Katherine replied, wiping his forehead with a cool cloth. "But you're not allowed to leave me, do you understand? We still have more years ahead of us." "Yes, madam," James said with a ghost of his old grin. He recovered, though he moved more slowly afterward. William took over most of the physical work of the ranch, while James provided guidance and wisdom. It was a good arrangement, father and son working together to ensure the legacy would continue. Grace finished medical school and returned to Texas, opening a practice in the nearest town. She visited often, checking on her parents with a professional eye that both reassured and amused Katherine. "I'm fine," Katherine would insist. "Stop trying to examine me every time you visit." "I'm a doctor. It's what I do," Grace would reply. But her eyes held such love that Katherine never really minded. Thomas's law practice flourished, and he became involved in state politics, fighting for education reform and workers' rights. Katherine was proud of how he used his education to help others, to make the world a better place. Mary's school had grown into a thriving institution, serving not just ranch children but students from miles around. She'd inherited her mother's gift for teaching and her father's determination, and the combination made her an exceptional educator. Katherine and James celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. It was a beautiful celebration, full of stories and laughter and love. 30 years, James said during his toast. 30 years since I convinced the bravest woman I've ever known to take a chance on a cowboy with more dreams than sense. Best thing that ever happened to me was knocking on her door that night. Everything good in my life flows from that moment. Katherine stood beside him, their hands clasped together. "I was invisible before you," she said. "A spinster with no prospects, no future. You saw me. You chose me. You built a life with me. These 30 years have been the greatest gift I could have asked for." Their children raised glasses, their grandchildren cheered, and love filled the air like perfume. As they grew older, Katherine and James found joy in the simple things. Morning coffee on the porch, evening walks around the property, quiet conversations by the fire. They'd lived such a full life that they needed no grand adventures anymore. Simply being together was enough. When James was 78, he suffered a stroke. Grace rushed to help, and her quick action saved his life. But he was weakened afterward, his speech slurred, his right side partially paralyzed. Katherine never left his side during his recovery, sleeping in a chair next to his bed, helping him relearn basic tasks, encouraging him when he grew frustrated. "I'm sorry," he said one day, tears in his eyes. "I'm supposed to take care of you, and now you're taking care of me." Katherine took his hand firmly. "Marriage isn't about keeping score. We take care of each other. You've carried me through hard times. Now I carry you. That's what love is." With Katherine's patient help and Grace's medical expertise, James regained much of what he'd lost. He'd never be quite the same, would always move a bit slower and tire more easily. But he was alive, and to Katherine, that was everything. They celebrated their 40th anniversary quietly, just the two of them on the porch under the stars. James's speech was better but still halting. 40 years, he managed. "Should have been more. Wish I'd met you sooner." "We had exactly the time we were meant to have," Katherine said. "I wasn't ready for you when I was younger. I needed to go through what I went through to become the woman who could say yes to you." Everything happened exactly as it should. James leaned his head against hers. "Love you, always have, always will. I know I love you too, more than I can say." They sat together as they had so many nights before, finding peace in each other's presence. The ranch was quiet around them, the family scattered to their various homes, the work all done. Just two people who'd found each other against all odds and built something beautiful. Katherine was 70 when James died peacefully in his sleep. He was 83, and Grace said his heart simply wore out. Katherine was devastated but also grateful. They'd had 43 years together, which was more than many people got. And he'd gone peacefully, without pain or suffering. The funeral was huge. People came from all over, former ranch hands, business associates, friends, and family. Everyone had a story about James Porter, about his fairness, his kindness, his integrity. But for Katherine, he would always simply be the cowboy who'd knocked on her door and changed everything. Her children worried about her after James's death, hovering and fussing. But Katherine was stronger than they gave her credit for. Yes, she grieved. Yes, she missed him with an ache that never fully went away. But she also celebrated the life they'd shared, the love they'd known. She continued living on the ranch, refusing all suggestions that she move in with one of the children. This was her home, the place she and James had built together. She wasn't leaving it. Grace visited most often, checking on her mother and providing company. One evening they sat on the porch together, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "You regret it?" Grace asked. "Leaving Silver Creek, taking such a risk on a man you barely knew," Katherine smiled. "Not for a single second. I had 43 wonderful years with your father, 4 incredible children, more grandchildren and great-grandchildren than I can count. I went from being a lonely spinster to having a life so full of love I can barely contain it. How could I regret that?" "I want what you and Papa had," Grace admitted. "That kind of partnership, that deep love." "Then be brave enough to reach for it when it appears," Katherine advised. "Don't let fear or what other people think hold you back. I almost did, you know. I almost said no to your father because I was scared, because it seemed too good to be true. Thank God I didn't." Katherine lived another 8 years after James's death. She remained sharp and engaged, doting on her growing family, helping William run the ranch, attending all the grandchildren's important events. She was there when Thomas argued his first case before the Supreme Court, when Mary's school celebrated its 20th anniversary, when Grace was named chief of medicine at her hospital. She held her first great-great-grandchild when she was 76, marveling at the tiny face and thinking about the chain of love that had started with one brave decision so many years ago. When Katherine was 78, she took ill suddenly. Grace rushed to her side, but they both knew this was different. Katherine's body was simply wearing out, ready for rest. Her children gathered around her bed, along with many of the grandchildren. Katherine looked at their faces, so many faces, so much love, and felt complete. "I need you all to know something," she said, her voice weak but clear. "I was called a spinster once. People pitied me, thought my life was over at 27, but then your father knocked on my door and told me I was his future. And because I was brave enough to believe him, to say yes, I got all of this. I got all of you. You are my legacy, my joy, my greatest accomplishment. Never let anyone tell you it's too late for happiness, too late for love. It's never too late if you're brave enough to reach for it." Thomas was crying openly. "Thank you, Mama, for everything." "No tears," Katherine said. "I've lived a beautiful life. I'm ready to see your father again. I've missed him terribly." She died that night peacefully, surrounded by love. Her funeral was even larger than James's had been. The ranch had to erect tents to hold everyone who came to pay their respects. Grace gave the eulogy, her voice strong despite her tears. "My mother showed us that courage isn't about being fearless, it's about being afraid and doing the brave thing anyway. She was terrified when she left Silver Creek with my father, but she did it anyway. And because of that single act of courage, all of us are here. She built a legacy not of wealth or power, but of love, and that's the greatest legacy anyone can leave." Katherine was buried next to James on a hill overlooking the ranch. Their graves were marked with simple stones that read, "James Porter, beloved husband and father," and "Katherine Porter, beloved wife and mother." But their true markers were everywhere in the faces of their descendants, in the stories passed down through generations, in the ranch that still stood strong. Years later, one of Katherine's great-great-granddaughters would stand at those graves and ask about the people buried there. And she would hear the story of the spinster and the cowboy, of a woman who was told she had no future and a man who said she was his. She would hear about courage and love and the beautiful life that came from one brave choice. "Remember this," her grandmother would say, passing down Katherine's wisdom one more generation. "It's never too late for happiness, never too late for love, never too late to be brave." And the story would continue, the legacy of love rippling forward through time, all because a lonely teacher had answered her door one night, and a cowboy had seen her worth when no one else did. All because Katherine Dolan had been brave enough to become Katherine Porter, to choose love over fear, to say yes to a future she couldn't see but dared to reach for anyway. In the end, she'd been called a spinster, but a cowboy had said she was his future. And together, they'd built something that would last forever, not buildings or wealth, but love. Pure, deep, lasting love that echoed through generations and proved that it's never, ever too late to find the life you were always meant to live.